So, hi everyone, thank you for joining. I hope that more participants will join us soon. Because if nothing else, it will be a pity to miss this presentation. Because today we have Peter Yanda with us. Peter was my line manager in GWI and one of the reasons that I joined the company back then. He is now the CTO at Pleo, and he will run a very interesting presentation. I know because I had a very quick look at it, about how they are running analytics at Pleo and how to facilitate them even further. During the presentation, please mute your mic, feel free to turn on your camera, use the chat for if you want to ask a question. And at the end of the session, we will invite you and we will strongly encourage you to ask any question you might have. Now, Peter, the floor is yours. You can, I'll stop sharing so that you can do.
Perfect.
And proceed with that.
Thank you. And let me know when you can see the slides. That's not my calendar.
Yep.
Perfect. So thanks so much for having me. It was a bit of time in making when we were discussing with Lefteris to come and speak a bit about how we do data in Pleo. Yeah, just to start it off, a little introduction of myself. So my name is Peter. I'm, as I describe it, technologist at heart, which means that I spent most of my career as an engineer. But given that I spent quite a few past years working with data as well, I sort of branch out from pure engineering and describe myself as a person who's very passionate around software, data, and building products. I spent some time blogging, so if you want to read some of my thoughts on the topic, you can find it on Substack, or you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and links are in touch on the screen. And yeah, my brief history with data and companies goes through predominantly these three logos you can see below. So I spent some time with GWI, where I was running the technology organization. Later, some time with a company called Merlon, which is building more of a hardcore AI solutions in the banking compliance space. And last 2 years here with Pleo, running the technology organization, which also includes data. And just to kick it off, I'll do a little explanation of what Pleo actually is about. So Pleo you can put into the bucket of fintech, so company focused on financial technology. And in our case, our mission or purpose is described in the sentence on the left-hand side, where we want for everyone to kind of say goodbye to expense reports. What that means is that, I guess, if you work for a company where you have to spend money, oftentimes you have to go through the process where you fill in some not so pleasant spreadsheets by the end of the month, collect a lot of receipts and submit it to the finance team. We believe that this is something what no longer should be happening, and we feel like this should be all digitized. So we built software, we connected with a card, and we try to get rid of all this process for our customers. And in the end, hopefully people can buy what they need and everything else is automated. And Pleo as a company is at this point about 6 years old. So we have some history already, where currently we are servicing about 20,000 customers, and we are growing quite rapidly, currently about 6 markets in Europe, but hopefully we'll expand way beyond that very soon. Unfortunately, not yet in Greece, but when we will be there, hopefully you will see a bit more about us around you. And I guess one more thing I put on the slide is that we are a quite well-funded company, which means that one of the key expectations for us is that we grow and hopefully grow very, very fast. And this is also one of the reasons why we spent some time investing into our data infrastructure and data analytics, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. So this is my first introduction of Pleo, and going forward, we hopefully focus more on the data. And to start, a bit of like why we even invest in data. I try to explain it very simply to people across the business of what is really the role of data in a company. And we formulate it as this sentence where we say we want to use data, not for the sake of data, but to really the business and how we operate. And we want to understand business because we want to make better decision across the company. So figuring out the ways how we can, through data, learn about what's happening and formulate it into data sets which we can then use and improve the ways how we operate the business. If I explain a little bit what does the business mean, this is a little bit complicated slide, but I can walk you through that, where one of the key aspects of running Pleo means that we work with quite a large number of companies who are constantly somewhere in the flow of getting to know us and essentially starting to use the product. So you can think of it at any point, there will be hundreds of different companies who are somewhere in the process through our kind of sales teams and onboarding, and really we're trying to get them as soon as possible to get the value and ultimately onboard on the product. If I look at it as a bit of a journey, I can bucket it roughly into these 5 steps, where on one side, I want to bring the awareness. So in this case, this would be activities to generate leads. I want to convince these people to decide that Pleo is a good product and it solves their needs. So in this case, converting leads into deals. From that point, because we're a financial institution, we have some obligations to comply with regulators who want us to do checks on companies and verify they are legitimate businesses, because we are eventually going to allow them to move money. And then we're going to spend some time setting them up for success, which means hitting a few important milestones, which could be anything from loading money to their Pleo cards or setting up their colleagues in the system, ordering cards, etc. And finally, we want to nurture them as they come to the product. So how are we working with them from the point when they came in, and how do we kind of grow them, get them as much value as possible, and also attract a large group of users in the company. Now, if you look through that journey, one of the other aspects is that we are using quite a lot of different tools. So from all different parts of the journey, there's a number of tools from advertising world, from CRM, from verification, from communication tools, and a lot of systems which are built in-house. I'm not going to name them all, but at this point you can think of it as dozens of different tools, which, as the customer goes through, all generate quite interesting data points. And they really give a lot of good stories about what's happening with every single account, and as well, how does the system works as a whole. Another aspect or another way you can look at this is through the lenses of teams, where essentially this process goes through the whole company. So on one side you have marketing, and later the process continues through sales teams. We have some teams focus on product-led onboarding, so we try to onboard companies without any necessarily sales process behind it. Verification goes through onboarding teams, compliance, CX team, support, and about 22 different product teams who are somewhere involved in building these solutions. So what you can get from that is that there's just so much data which we generate across the company, which we can use to understand what is going on. And if I kind of zoom into the better decision part, we look at it from kind of 3 different perspectives. When on one side, we want to have very good strategic overview of the company. So in that sense, we want to create holistic overview of the business. And we look at the business through lenses of different KPIs and driving metrics. So in that case, you can think of how are we understanding if the business is healthy and operating as we assume it should. what are key trends. So for example, are conversion rates somewhere in the pipeline growing or dropping? And is it happening in specific segments of the market or in specific geographies, stuff like that. But also as well, for example, if we release new products, we want to understand, are these products driving the adoption of the product as we wanted to? And you can bucket all these things into kind of strategic view of the business. On the other side, we have a bit more tactical aspect. So here what we try to do is to think about how can we use data to get kind of small pieces of information in front of the right people across the whole company in the tools where they work every day. What that means is that instead of pulling people out from where they work to different BI tools, we really want to land the data in front of them, be it in support system or in the sales system or in, closely to product managers who might be analyzing pieces of information about features they just released. And we really want to make sure that they have the data as close as possible. This case, we want to understand, for example, adoption of product features. So if I'm customer success representative and I have a client in front of me, I want to understand what kind of products they're already using, what they're not using, which might drive my conversation I have with them. Anything from understanding risk or things like unpaid invoices. And again, putting that in front of people who are close to the customer and making sure they have this data available as and when they are interacting with customer. And finally, the third bucket of what we want to get from data is what I would call analytical view, where oftentimes these kind of predefined views of the business don't tell full story. So what we want to be able to do is to dive into the data in more kind of analytical fashion, go deeper and kind of unpick some more complex relationships. So for example, we could be asking questions like, where are we making money? Is it from bigger companies, smaller companies in specific markets, and what kind of industries? So there's a lot of stuff we can analyze. Anything about how are features being used in the product in isolation or together, and really understanding like these points or views of the business which might not be that easily captured in a report or a dashboard. And a little bit about our data. I always say that in Pleo, we, in a way, are lucky that we are not really dealing with what I would describe as big data. So we don't really have mountains of different high velocity data streams. And our challenges are a lot more around how versatile this data is, because as you already have seen, there's a number of different tools. There's hundreds of analytical events which are happening through the flow of customers through the business. And we have quite a few different use cases where we want to use data. So from that perspective, you can think of it as that complexity of our data is much bigger challenge than volume. And that dictates a bit how are we thinking about building our teams, and also dictates a bit about how are we thinking about the technology stack which we need in the company to facilitate all these different use cases. And I'll dive into these two topics a bit separately, starting with the team and then later move on into the technology. So before we talk about like how the teams work or how they're organized, I think it's important to clarify what kind of competencies we're looking at, where I hope that there's no surprises here, where our kind of essential role in the analytics team is data analyst, which we look at it as like a job family, which could include any analytics from product perspective, GTM organization, from finance point of view. And really these people ideally work very close to the business, so very close to the area of business where they can operate. And their job is to figure out how we can put data to use. And this doesn't necessarily mean just building dashboards or providing reports, but as being as close as possible to the day-to-day operation, so they can also impact how are we thinking about data in the first place when we design new processes and put new things together. Second kind of big job family is our data engineering, and I put / software engineering, which is a group of people who are predominantly focused on building what I would call data platform, which is a technology stack which is allowing the analysts or allowing the teams to actually work with data. And a third key competence, which is relatively new to us, is we call analytics engineering, where the motivation here is that, as you will see shortly, the complexity of data models which we have to build across a company is growing. And historically, we had a lot of data analysts spending a lot of time building data models, spending a lot of time in data warehouse. And we would like to actually help them to get much closer to the business and essentially get some of the job off their hands and put it into hands of analytical engineers, which I think in history could have been called something like BI engineer, or some of the data engineers were doing this work. But due to kind of nature of tools we're using and what we see on the market, we really see this role is kind of emerging in different companies. So we don't want to create too unique description. We kind of follow the trends in the industry. And to explain how actually this whole fits into the organization, I think it's important to explain a bit of how is Pleo organized. And to get to the final state, I felt it would be good to walk a little bit through the history. And if you look at Pleo about 2 years ago, you can look at it as a combination of two key organizations. I've purposely left out a few different departments who are of course here. So finance, HR, IT, they are of course in the company, but if we still keep focused on the kind of customer journey, you can think of it roughly as these organizations, where on one side you have our go-to-market teams, which has the usual suspects of marketing, sales, customer success, and support. And on the other side, you have product organization, which is organized into small product teams, which are each building part of the experience for the end user, very cross-functional. So engineering, design, product is all put together into these teams, which are then allocated to build different parts of Pleo product experience. So you might have a team focused on website, or team focused on onboarding, or team focused on employee experience, or etc. And as you can see in 2019, there is no data anywhere. And we actually started fairly small. So it's about 2 years ago where we really started with just 2 people. So there was one product analyst and one engineer who were together trying to figure out how to put any of this into place. And at this point, you are looking at Pleo as an organization with about 100 people. So the complexity of organization starts growing, the complexity of product starts growing. And really, it's only then when we started to build some of the foundation of data organization as we see it today. If I fast forward to about a year to the future, and talking about like first half of 2020, you will start to see a few notable moves where on one side, we've invested into our data team by bringing data engineers. So going from 1 to about 4, it's quite decent growth. And the reasoning behind that was that if we hire analytics skills or people who do analysis, but they don't really have the right tools in place, it would be very inefficient. So the hypothesis here was that it would make sense to kind of front load more investments into the technology stack to create a better environment where afterwards the analytics teams will be a lot more productive. So that's why kind of investment in data was a bit earlier before we started growing analytics team. Nevertheless, it was also part of the journey where Pleo started to grow really, really fast, where we felt that we would benefit from even more immediate understanding of more kind of detailed driving forces across, especially across marketing and sales. And this is why we also started to build this new organization called Commercial Analytics, which was mainly focused on understanding of our commercial performance, how are we spending our marketing budgets, and are we actually generating leads with the scale we wanted, and eventually converting them through sales organization. And you also can imagine like these numbers are very important for the board and investors and leadership of the company, which is predominantly what drove the investment into these areas. But as you can see here, is we're still keeping all the people across these two teams. So you have commercial analytics team as one unit, and data as more kind of general naming was second. But you don't see any analysts across the organization yet. Moving on to start of 2021, so about 11 months ago, you can see kind of new team appearing, which is called product analytics, and the analyst, the only analyst we had earlier in data is now moved there, and essentially you start to see a structure where on one side you have data engineering organization who is focused on progressing build of the technology capabilities. And on top of that, you have two analytics units, one focused on commercial, one focused on product, who are aligning to these different kind of pillars of the organization, being the go-to-market and product. At that time, also product is getting very complicated. So we start to group product teams into what we call domains, which is these little boundaries. So 2, 3, 4 product teams are grouped into domains. And we're starting to think of how would we go about enabling analytics capabilities closer to these teams, because at this point, the organization is about twice as big, so about 250 people. It's growing really fast, and at that point, we have 4 analysts kind of servicing the needs of our organization. So we really felt we need to start investing a bit more heavily. It was a little bit delayed because of pandemic, and of course, it had impact on many businesses and as well on us, but nevertheless, as soon as 2021, we started to accelerate investment in analytics beyond what we did before. And if I zoom to today, what you start to see is that we're starting to shift the model where there is still few central teams. So data engineering stayed pretty much the same. Commercial analytics and product analytics still has some central people who are, it's of course, they're focused on leading the function and doing some of the more generic analysis. But we start to see people going much closer to the business. So in marketing, sales, CX, you will start to see analysts who are dedicated to these areas of the business. And for us, it's important that, as I said earlier, that they really get to understand what is happening in there. And in that sense, they are bringing a lot more data discussions and capabilities closer to these teams and eventually embedding the data discipline. On the product side, exactly the same thing, with the caveat that given that we today have 22 different product teams, we are not able to put analysts to every single one of them. And we follow kind of rationale of, rather than splitting analysts into every analyst has to service or work with 4 or 5 different teams, which is still too much. What we rather did is we did an analysis of the different teams and where are they with their data maturity and where are they with their needs. And we identified which parts of the business would be benefiting the most from having much better overview of what's happening and much better insights from their data. So for example, if I look at areas such as onboarding, where you can see this kind of high volume of companies going in and going through the funnel, and some of them on the way maybe deciding not to go forward, it's very important that this team has strong data and understands what's happening with the funnel, what kind of changes in a product are impacting the conversion in a good way and bad way. And they really need that data feedback very close. If you compare it with other teams who are working on some of our core payment infrastructure, they would of course benefit from data too, but given the investment framework, we felt that it would be more appropriate to pick a few teams where you really dive in and we let these analysts truly understand what's happening rather than kind of spreading them too thin. And one more important thing which happened here, and that's actually happening just now, is it's only now we're introducing this analytics engineering discipline, where we hope that as a result of that, the analytics teams will be even more able to go across the organization. And if I move to the future and look at what we want to do next year, it would look something like this, where essentially analytics is way more embedded across organizations. So every single GTM team has one or more analysts who are working very closely with them. Much bigger proportion of product teams are getting analysts too. So in some areas close to, for example, the conversion funnel, all the teams will have analysts. And we also will see more analysts everywhere else in the product. And we will be following the same principle, where in some of the teams we invest fully. So we have analysts on the team. And in some of the areas where we can't go that deep, we at least deploy some analytics talent into the domain. So at least group of teams has one person who is very close to them and is able to work with them very closely. What is as well happening is that we're introducing data science as a separate function. This is mainly focused on building some user-facing and data-powered product features, where I think we're going to follow the same model, where we start the team as a central unit. So the team is started as a small unit together, but the overall direction in the long run would be to embed them into the teams. And for example, in this diagram, I said in one of the team, maybe it makes sense to go straight away into that model. We also, in this model, we believe that analytics engineers are going to branch out from data engineering a bit more, and they get much closer to the analytics team. So, for example, building data models for the product organization is like a specific area where we want to have the analytics engineer close to. Versus if I look at commercial organization, I'm working with very different business entities, and I might benefit from analytic engineers who know that space really well. What as well happens is that we don't want to just embed analytics, but also engineering or data engineering is going closer to the organization, where we believe that as we progress with our journey to build a data platform, we're more likely going to have cases where the data engineers go closer to the teams where it makes a lot of sense to work almost from the other end. So given I have a good data platform capabilities, I can now go to the team, work with them, and change their internal ways of working to produce better data. So in that sense, I'm bringing data engineers closer to the organization. So the data which comes through the data platform is in a better shape, which is making job of analytical engineers easier, which is making job of analysts easier. And where is this all heading? It's like few of these guiding principles we use is that we believe that we will always have some degree of central engineering team, which is going to be focused on building data platform. We optimize for the analytics engineers to go close to the business areas. So as I said, close to GTM or product. Data analysts are fully deployed across the organization, where they have a central guild. In that sense, you can think of it as a mechanism for all the analysts to share their experiences of working with our data, and essentially kind of knowledge sharing information from across the company, and at the same time for leadership to have a chance to impact how are we thinking of evolving our analytical capabilities, and how are we thinking about evolving our practice around data. But day to day, as analysts are deployed, their priorities are very close to their teams. And finally, we believe in bringing machine learning capabilities in the same way as analytics. So as I said, starting centrally, but eventually deploying to the organization. When it comes to leadership, one of the very key moments or very important decisions was that we brought director of data, which means that at that point, we're essentially grouping all the capabilities around analytics under one leader, which means that there is a person who has a remit to work across the whole company to basically set a practice of how we as an organization work with data. And I say it's very important because it wasn't always the case. And given that you might have a part of analytics organization reporting to one side of the business and another part of organization reporting to another side of business, it then creates challenges in terms of how well these communities can work together. So for us, we're very big on bringing people with the same competency together, so we can kind of facilitate the collaboration. And the director essentially is a grouping force from overseeing commercial analytics, product analytics together, and then joining it with the engineering. So in that sense, the engineering is very close, and the director has a chance to define the capabilities of data platform, as well as influence the workflows of all the analysts and make it all strategically work together. And I've also added the lead data scientist, which is not the case today, but it's a team which we believe should belong to the same kind of group or to the same organization. And to make it a little bit more complicated, we believe that this is the way how we drive data capability across the company. But we also have what we call accountability reporting, where essentially director of data is at this point closely aligned to me. So it's part of technology organization. But we feel it's very important that, for example, commercial analytics head is very aligned with our RevOps organization, which is defining how GTM organization works as a whole. So if I have a leader who is responsible to define how data should work across that side of organization, it makes a lot of sense for them to work very close with the head of commercial analytics. Same stuff exactly on the other side with head of product analytics and the chief product officer, where again, we want them to work very closely together in terms of what are the priorities for analytics in that area of the business. And I drew a few of these dotted lines from analytics engineering, where we believe that it's a good idea to have analytics engineer reporting to engineering manager from competency perspective. So getting guidance of how to progress their career or how to resolve some of the more tricky technology challenges. But again, from the priority perspective, they get close to the commercial or product analytics team, where we define like what are the particular models which might need more attention. So I hope this gives you a bit of a sense of how we organize the teams or how we're thinking about that. And I wanted to double down a bit on the technology side. And before we dive into like what technology we're using, I think it's important to explain like what do we actually need. So from the technology perspective, it's all about tooling. So for us, technology means we build tools for a variety of different things we need to work with data. So it goes from making sure we can store data, transform, process it, move it from A to B, means moving it across the company. We want to provide access for both BI purposes, but also data science. And we also want to make sure that we ensure the quality. In ideal world, we're not quite there fully, but we aim to get to the point where all these tools are provided as a service. So none of the other parts of organization necessarily have to build any specific data toolings. And given that we are thinking about machine learning in the future, we also believe that ML ops will be part of this data platform in the future as well. Then I feel that the best way to describe how we're actually using these tools, I would like to kind of talk you through the flow of data through the company, where I think one of the first challenges we needed to solve is how are we thinking of bringing all this data from all the tools across the organization together? And we essentially realized that there is not really a single tool we can use in this case, because we have at this point three very distinct ways, or three distinct parts of the business which we need to pull data from. One is from all the commercial tools, where today we use a tool called Fivetran, which is basically off-the-shelf subscription-based solution where we kind of configure integrations, and it works out of the box, which works very well for us because we try to not to build any custom solutions where we don't have to. On the other side, we have Kafka, which is maintained as part of our general engineering infrastructure, which is helping all our backend systems to move data from the services to the warehouse. And finally, we use a tool called Segment, which is helping us to essentially collect event level data from all across our portfolio of products, from website to back office to mobile, etc. If I combine these three, we essentially cover all different use cases of moving data from different tools across the company. And luckily, 2 out of the 3 tools are subscription as a service, and Kafka is fairly well maintained component in the company. And as such, these 3 ways combined give ability to any team to move data to the warehouse. One note here is that it's definitely worth mentioning 2 different tools called Airbyte and Snowplow, which we're looking into as potential alternatives for our existing tools. Reason is that they are both open source and potentially might make sense as we start to hit much bigger scales of data. For the time being, I always look at it as a cost ratio, where paying subscription product typically is more expensive, but also less involved. And for us, it's all about timing it right, where it might make sense to swap one of them. And what happens with the data afterwards? Well, in our case, it's very simple. We basically land all of this data into BigQuery. We don't have any data lake at the moment, where we didn't feel the need to do so. This is predominantly driven by the fact that we don't really have such large quantities of data. So landing data straight to BigQuery means that we don't have any prohibitive costs to do so. And of course, BigQuery allowing SQL type analysis means that all of this data is fairly easily accessible to the analytics community without having to use a number of different tools and a number of different solutions. So for us, it works very well. And given that we have a number of different use cases, we also care a lot around kind of latency of data as it flows through the company. So in this case, pretty much any data from any operational tools arrives to the warehouse within an hour. In some cases, we have data as fast as 5 minutes, which means that you have a very fresh view of the business in the warehouse, almost near real time. And what we do with that? Well, we can pipe it into a number of different corners of the company and essentially facilitate these different use cases. And I'll explain it from the bottom going all the way up, where on one side we have Amplitude, which actually connects directly to the segment and is used across product organization to help them analyze user behavior, where we really subscribe to this because there's a lot of product-specific analysis, which otherwise we would have to build a lot of custom solutions for. We then are deploying Looker, which is replacing Metabase, which we used so far, and we felt we kind of outgrown it as an organization. But ultimately, this is a place where we facilitate most of the kind of use of the business for reporting purposes or even for exploratory analysis. And then we have 2 different use cases, which I would categorize as operational analytics, where we essentially take data from the data warehouse and we pipe it back to the business. So in this case, one example would be moving data to the tool called Customer IO, which we use for communication to the user. So for example, we might be collecting information about what kind of events this user did or didn't do in the application, feed it into customer IO, and customer IO is then able to communicate with the user and send them the right nudges and help them kind of move forward through their journey in the product. Equally, using a tool called Census, we can move data back to HubSpot. So in this case, HubSpot is our CRM, which is used by GTM organization. And what this means is that we can collect a lot of different information from across our product, compile it analytically into new views of the business, and then through Census land it in front of our salespeople as they are working with these customers. And I think one important thing to say here is that we have this BigQuery in the middle, and in one side we're lending a lot of raw data into it, and on the other side we have quite a versatile use cases for this data. And I think it would be fair to say it would be very tricky to configure all these tools if we were all the time working with the raw data. So one of the thought we had is, well, if I have this warehouse in the middle and I have a lot of the data coming from the left-hand side to the warehouse, and on the right-hand side, I want to put it in front of people through Looker and through Census or Segment to connect it with the business. The question we had was, how can we facilitate the modeling, and how can we solve for that? And to give you kind of more conceptual view of this, we thought about it as kind of multi-stage process where on the one side, we load all the data into the warehouse as is. So we drop it as raw as possible, where we want to avoid any transformations on the way to the warehouse to make sure that this data, that we can kind of replay the logic or work with it going forward. We then model this data into what we call core models. So in this case, we start to combine different pieces of data together. So you can think of it as model for the company, which has information from billing in Stripe and information about usage of the product or previous interactions from the sales organization. We combine this into these nicer and cleaner models, which we then model into data marts, which is essentially more consumption optimized data set, which is then plugged into our BI tools. What this means is that I'm going from kind of more raw data sets to more prepared and more kind of aggregated view of the business as I go through the warehouse from left to right. We also made one very deliberate choice here where we segregated fully our data sets, which are piping back to the operational tools. So for example, back to the use case of collecting information about what users did in the application and then feeding it back to the customer IO, it's very, very important that this data is accurate. Because, for example, if we were to send a wrong data into customer IO, we might be sending wrong emails to 10, 20, 30,000 people. So we really want to avoid that. And this was one of the decisions why we felt that it would be important that we segregate some data sets which are feeding these systems from analytical systems, because we felt that the complexity which is involved in some of our analytics models is too large, and we open ourselves too much to potential error. So this is where we can force ourselves to do much simpler modeling exercise to create these data sets, which are then a bit more reliable and have more stricter rules to make sure that the data flows as directly as possible without too much transformation, which might introduce errors. And I think final thought on this exercise is that we are only adopting Looker as of last few months, where we feel that in a previous model, we spent a lot of time kind of moving data through different stages, and we felt like the data mart layer is in the world where we use Looker and their Looker modeling language is that we're losing the need to essentially maintain another data mart, and we're planning to move some of the logic from what we historically did in a warehouse into the LookML as models and essentially remove layers of data in the warehouse. And the reason we do that is that we really want to make sure that the journey through the warehouse is as simple as possible, and less steps we have on the way, less complexity we have to manage. And it's because actually the diagram I've shown is much simplified version of the reality, where if I look at some of the lineage of our data, this little pink thing in the middle is our company's model, and you can see that it's connected to quite a broad range of different models across the whole warehouse, which means that the complexity of it is not very trivial, which means that more we add, more tricky it is for analytical community to navigate all that. So we really want to be careful that even though the warehouse is very powerful, it allows us to do a lot of these transformations. We want to make sure that we don't spend too much time in there. And this is one of the reasons why we decided to adopt a DBT as one of the key tools to essentially maintain the warehouse, where for time being, all our data transformations are using SQL, and DBT is helping us to orchestrate all these models and essentially allow the community to build these models on top of each other. It also allows us to introduce more kind of engineering workflow. So all our analytical SQL code is maintained as any other production code for any. It also allows us to build these fairly complex models, where in this case, today we have about 1,500 data models from 27 different contributors, and doing kind of constant changes all the time, where we're counting somewhere over 1,300 different pull requests, which we're doing as we modifying our analytics. How does it work in practice? We essentially have this repository which has very nicely organized set of definitions. So, for example, here I'm just zooming a bit into our product teams are defining what activated cards are, what activated employees are, or active expenses. So in this case, essentially the data team is modeling some of these concepts, which can be then used in models down the line. And if you're going to dive into one of these files, it's nothing else than SQL code with some of the specific annotations, where you can see that I can, for example, reference our user V2 model and pull data from that to create another level of model focused on activated employees. So in this case, I'm trying to find out which of these users are actually active in the application. And you can think of this as that this code is essentially allowing us to create more and more specific views of the business using SQL code and building on top of each other, which essentially gives us a nice composability where we can start to create very good and detailed views of the business. This all goes through the same process as other engineering codes. So for example, we go through the process of pull requests, which means that any analyst who is modifying some of the key models is essentially requesting a change, describing why is this change happening, and they're getting approval from someone else in the community, which is essentially helping them to see, like, yeah, this is good, we can deploy this change, and we don't believe it's going to break anything. We also have a number of tests which are embedded in DBT, which are essentially helping us to ensure that all the data flows nicely through the system. And this is how it works under the hood, where, for example, this model focused on defining table of active users, essentially drawing data from about 25 different sources, where under the hood, we are able to define very granular ways to describe some of the concepts. So for example, for us, active user is a person who is in the company, who has all the invoices paid, or who did one of the key events or key features, used some of the key features across the product, which means that the definition of active user is not very trivial. And what is very nice about this analytical approach is that we can very quickly evolve this definition. So if we decide next week that we feel that it would be better to involve some other key feature into the definition because it indicates that the user is active in the platform, it's relatively easy to add into this logic and essentially extend the definition very easily in a very controlled way. And as soon as this model change is accepted, then every single dashboard or definition where this is used is automatically updated, which is, of course, helping us a lot to maintain the system at its sometimes very complex stage. But nevertheless, we don't feel like we're done. There's actually quite a few different components which we feel like we're missing. So we're looking into a number of these. So in this case, it's improving our data catalog, where DBT provides some basic version of that. And the screenshots from the lineage I've used before are actually from DBT. But nevertheless, we're looking at some of the more feature complete data catalogs out there. Same goes from lineage, where we have good data lineage of data inside of the warehouse, but we would love to see the lineage expanding to the BI tool and potentially a bit more to the sources, and facilitate some of more advanced use cases around data governance, for example, tracking PII through the whole system or tracking sensitive data. We also believe that we will be investing some work into metrics management. So as a company, we're growing, we're having a complex set of metrics which we use to measure the business. So figuring out a tooling or ways how we can kind of keep that under control. And finally, we also believe that we should be investing more into data quality tooling, where we have DBT tests today, but we feel that there is more kind of we should do and more quality tools we should bring. So if you have any great examples of these tools, please feel free to reach out, and I would be gladly happy to talk about that. And before I finish, I wanted to share a few bumps on the road, because some of these things are, I would say, in a good shape and fairly advanced, but we also realized that there were a number of things which we could have done much better, or we will still have to deal with in the future. And I want to share definitely two main ones, which I feel were the biggest obstacles, where one of the biggest pains I see in the company is that it's very painful if we think about analytics as something what's not very well connected with the business. And I've used this visualization. I think it's coming from some presentations from Data Mesh, actually, originally, where I don't want to kind of be going into this with the Data Mesh lenses, but I felt like this was very inspirational to just understand that it's really complicated if the operations teams are not very aware of what happens to the data after this data potentially gets produced and moved to the warehouse. And in the middle of this, you have data platform teams who are trying to kind of make sense of it and figure out how to build some of the data models or build some of the infrastructure. And the analytics teams are complaining that the data is always changing and breaking, and they don't know how to kind of keep on top of that as the business moves. Because one thing is very certain, that in any scale-up company, the company changes all the time. So the operational teams are changing everything on the ongoing basis, which means that they constantly are changing how data gets produced, and the analysts are always behind. So it's one of the things where we believe one of the key ways to overcome this is exactly what we do with the teams, where we're bringing the analysts way closer to the businesses and almost help us advocate for the data across the organization, rather than being siloed somewhere in the company and essentially struggling to get their voice close to the operational teams who might be potentially breaking some of their workflows. And it's a little bit pity in a way that in the end, it's the operational teams who are potentially affected by the fact that they don't have good analytics. And that's because the operations has moved. So it's a bit of a circle, which I feel we have to solve. And the way we are tackling this is that we're bringing both of these two teams together. And in ideal world, and we're not fully there, but we're getting close, is to completely move data platform teams and data engineering out of the way, where they really focus on the technology and capabilities, but they don't really get involved in how is the data modeled and how are these pipelines running. That's for the operational and analytics teams to do. And second one, which I always find very tricky, is in our case, we let some of the, I would call messy SQL into the system, where if you think of it, maintaining about 1,500 models is complicated on its own, but it's something what's doable. But what we have to make sure is that all the SQL in each of these models is in a good shape. And I think it's fair to say that some of these models were built a bit faster or hastily than we thought, so we have to pay that price. But if I was to advise anyone to, when they set up a system like this, I would pay a lot more attention to setting maybe stronger guidelines into how the SQL is written, and be a bit more diligent in making sure that even if we are potentially in a rush, we don't take too much of that code in, because it's really hard to get it out. And just to conclude, I have a few kind of high level lessons learned from all this journey, where one of them is, I think, what I described as great data is just never a side effect. And I think it's great to see that as we hire more kind of data analysts and engineers, is that we see this mentality changing in a company, where maybe a few years back, the data wasn't really on top of mind of the teams, where they were producing all sorts of data as a result of their day-to-day operation, but it felt very much as a side effect, whilst we're getting to the world where the data is a lot more thought through when things get designed. So when the product is designing next features, we talk more about data. When the operational teams are designing their process, we talk about what does that mean for the data, which is ultimately making the whole system a lot easier and pleasant to work with. Second, which we are somewhere on the journey, is to create a strong ownership model for data, where essentially without ownership model, it's sometimes very tricky to understand who should be responsible if something goes wrong, where you on one side have teams who are maintaining this data sources. In the middle, you have a lot of analytical models, and on the end, you have some broken dashboard, and someone's unhappy that they can't do analysis they want. And without a good ownership model, it's very hard to actually figure out who to go to and how to get out of that situation. And for us, we kind of follow the journey of data, where we try to get ownership of data as close as possible to the source. So in this case, ideally, source data producer or the operational team owns the data as it arrives to the warehouse. Then analytical teams own the data models, which are essentially built on that. And then we have dedicated owners on the dashboards, which are then feeding from that. So I can essentially traverse the system and always understand who is the next person I need to talk to resolve any of the issues. And finally, I think, at least what I see in Pleo and in talking with my peers, I feel that data is becoming very important, much more important in the world post-pandemic, where everything is getting even more digital and more remote. And I feel like data is getting like the prominence in the business, and I no longer think that it's enough to have some sort of data team somewhere in the organization, and we should think of it a lot more as kind of essential business competence, which we try to, again, facilitate by getting data-minded people all across the organization, where we're then empowering every part of the organization to work with data where they are, and essentially have that competence, rather than relying on some central team who will provide these skills where we feel that that's just not enough. And finally, I think to get any of this done, I think, as I said, data is very important, and it's also like becoming more and more prominent, which means that there is not that much talent who has 10, 15 years experience, but nevertheless, I'm very happy to see around in the industry that data is really getting quite important. It's getting very attractive, it's attracting a lot of talent, not just from analytics, but from engineering. And I believe that that's one of the key ingredients to actually solve some of that. So we definitely need help. So if any of this sounded interesting, I'll be happy to talk about that. And yeah, for the rest, I have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Peter. There's so many questions I want to ask you. But I would like to first give the opportunity to someone from the participants to ask something if they have in mind. Feel free, now it's the time. Or I can go with my first question and perhaps give them some time. No, Erwan. Erwan, have you raised your hand?
Yes, I did. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for that presentation. Very nice, very interesting. And I've got one question on your slide when you described the next steps you wanted to perform. And it was unclear for me the exact difference and the purposes between data catalog and metrics management.
Yeah. So to me, like I look at it as like two different pieces, where data catalog to me is something what is solving the data discovery use case. So I'm trying to figure out how can I find the most accurate or most well-defined data for the use case I have in mind. And from metric management, I think it has some cataloging aspect where I want to understand where is the latest piece of that metric. But I also think that you can think of metric as something has like a lot broader workflow. So for example, if I look at LookML or DBT, I essentially think of it as how am I going from the journey of defining this metric, getting it agreed across the organization, and essentially codified into the SQL code, which then gets deployed to the warehouse and then becomes available to be used. So to me, metrics management is this journey where I'm going and defining it and codifying. And then, of course, the result of that work should end up in a catalog. So as a person who is maybe anywhere in the business, I can type in and say, okay, the revenue is coming from this metric and I find it here. So this is how I can distinguish these two, if that makes sense.
Great, clear, thank you.
Any other question, or perhaps the next question to put it better? Yeah. Peter, I'll take the last slide as a personal compliment, given that you hired me at least once in the past. So thank you. Would you rather I start asking from the first part of the presentation and move, take the same path, or take it backwards? Start from the fresher parts.
Anywhere.
Anywhere, okay. So one thing that I've been struggling in more than one company is the data ownership that you touched, and it's a subtle topic really. But how can you really give the ownership back to the people that technically do have it? I mean, it's not a discussion who owns certain data. Mm-hmm. But while in the past, I mean, you can talk with the product relatively easily. You can, find some middle ground. But for more commercial teams, like sales, for example, do you have any suggestion how to?
Yeah. I mean, it's very much on top of our mind, and I would say it's not even that easy with the product teams as well as with GTM teams, where I guess like there's multiple ways to unpack this. Where one example, which I was also told by someone, like, why don't you just go and tell them, like, hey, you just own this data, it's your work now, and it's your responsibility. But we all kind of know that doesn't really work, because I often feel that I can't tell you what to do if I don't give you all the necessary tools to do the job really well. And I think that's where I would focus the attention of, if I want to make sure that the teams own the data or really feel the ownership of producing great data, I think I need to give them the tools to do it well. And for me, like, one aspect of this is the technology platform. So when we kind of talked earlier about giving them tools to ingest data to the warehouse, or giving tools to model the data in the warehouse, and like getting that as good as possible, which means that they don't really have to do that much of work to do the right thing. So that to me is like the technology aspect. And I think even more important aspect to me was the exact work with the data analytics capabilities of, if I bring that analyst to the team, what will start to happen is that that analyst starts to talk with the peers of like, yeah, this is actually breaking. We should think more about how we're gonna ensure that this tracking is always in place. And I have this idea, and you start to see that the mentality start to change from within. And to me, basically, the analytics people are essentially like the agent of the change. So to me, like sending the people very close to the source, giving them the right tools, means that you start to see the good habits more often. But I don't think it's an easy or fast thing to do. And I think you can apply the same for the GTM organization, where I think we're very lucky. We hired very data-minded VP of RevOps, who basically looked through the system and said, we need to improve this. We're going to cut here. We're going to clean this. And this is the goal for my organization. And he actually works very closely with the commercial analytics, which is embedded in his domain, which means that they have very close relationship when they kind of have very good feedback loops between them. So to me, like the simple answer is just getting the data people close to the source means that when data people consume the data, it's more likely in a good shape.
So the decentralized model that you are gradually sliding towards must have been playing a role into that. So you get the analysts closer to the original, the creators, let's say, of the data, and therefore you kind of invite them to understand it better and maintain it in a better fashion, right?
I think like this is where it's important that the role of analyst is not just to kind of provide data back to the stakeholders, but also to be the influencing power in the early stages. Nice. I think that part is like something what I feel still needs some work, but I think the analyst really needs to be invited very early into the process, and in that case has a chance to basically impact how the team works with data.
For once, I completely agree with that. But into a more tool-oriented question, what if there was no DBT? I know how much you love it, but if you could not use it, how could you surrogate that?
It's a good question, because I think I can tell you what I've seen or what I've done before, and there was painfully stitching together some sort of Python scripts which were pulling data in and out. And I think, I mean, technically, if you look at what DBT really does, is that it manages the SQL at scale where there's nothing really preventing you to create that SQL manually to say, create table X as a select from Y. You can technically do all of that. And I would probably, if there was no DBT, I would probably code something what felt a bit like DBT, where what I think is really good benefit is that the data never leaves the warehouse. It's just instrumenting, or it's giving commands to the warehouse of create a table using the SQL from this other table. What that means is that it's really fast. And I think I wouldn't underestimate that DBT does a great job of managing the SQL, but the actual power horse is the warehouse itself. And I think it's just very nicely complementing each other and playing into the trend that these warehouses are just super powerful today. And sometimes I'm just like amazed by how complex SQL you can run in seconds over huge data sets, and it just does the job. So nice. I feel like I think I would definitely stay within the warehouse as much as I can, because the power is just insane. And I would use a different way to work in SQL inside of the warehouse, if that makes sense.
Okay, nice. In case it's not already clear, I'm joining you from the room of my daughter. And in fact, I used one of her paintings to write several questions at the back, but I'll go with one last for the economy of time. In the slide that you had the potential, the projection, team structure for 22, I counted 28 figures, and I understand that this is illustrative, but that triggered a question in my head. Do you have a rough idea of the ratio of analysts or data professionals, let's say, in the company versus? So what's the ratio of the people or the percentage to make this work?
It makes sense. I think we definitely don't drive from the percentage because it might be quite tricky, but I think so let me see. So let's do a bit of math. So if we like 28, 30 people and we might be with today 400, we might be doubling to about 800. So that's about 30. I would say 30, 40 out of 800 wouldn't be unreasonable, which is what, like 3.5 to 5%. I think that I've read few articles which I can't scientifically quote, but looking at the same numbers, and in some of the organizations actually going beyond to like 5-7% territory.
7%.
So
Nice.
I think I would hope that we go even faster than that, but we also want to be realistic and don't go too crazy.
Nice. Last opportunity for someone to ask any question from the participants.
Yeah, I have one. I would like to ask regarding the line managers, because you showed in the slide that they report to the chief of data, most analysts, data scientists, etc. But you also showed that they're embedded in the specific product teams or commercial teams, etc. How does that work? Like, for example, how is their everyday life? Do they join huddles? Do they do the planning with the product teams, or like how do they cooperate between the two functions?
Yeah, very, very good question. Where we have this concept in Pleo in general, where we talk about the accountability management, which is essentially where are you getting priorities from, and that is typically aligned around the team. So in that case, there is a lead of the team, typically product manager, who essentially aligns the group, which in this case could be product manager, engineering lead, number of engineers, and analyst. And this is your primary group where you work every day. So the analyst would be much closer every day to the team itself. So they would be going into the stand-ups with the product management and engineers and following really these rituals. And the other reporting lines we call competence-based, which is essentially oriented around who is the most competent person to manage you as an analyst in the company. So in that case, the product analyst would report to head of product analytics, and that would report to director. And the rationale here is that from these people, you get more of a support on kind of competence basis, which means that if you're running into some tricky technical decision or any kind of maybe conflict with the teammates and saying, how do I convince them to care more about data in this particular case, that line manager is typically well equipped to help you overcome some of these challenges, seeing the same things from across elsewhere in the team. So this essentially balances like your kind of day-to-day priorities with some of more of like competence-based ones, where from the line manager, you also get some guidelines in terms of this is how we think about data as a company. So if we write SQL, we don't want to write messy SQL, and this is the boundaries you should work with. Or if we want to build new product features, we would like to have tracking defined in this way. This is happening kind of on competence basis. And then the analysts are bringing this to the teams day to day, and they work with the product management, where in some cases, product management is more focused on like where do we focus day to day, but they are not necessarily defining on the how are we working with data, if that makes sense. And we have the same practice in engineering or product management itself, where I'm, for example, focused on how do engineers work in a company and what are the practices we want to spread, but I'm not controlling their day-to-day priorities, because that would be a very overwhelming job, and they are much better to do that in their team.
Thank you, that's clear.
Any other question? Any follow-up, perhaps addition on previous questions? I think we should be using Slido. moving forward. This might invite more people to ask things. But for the time being, Peter, again, thank you so much. This has been really useful, really interesting for me. And yeah, I can't wait to find more about how you take it from here.
Perfect. My pleasure. Thanks for having me. And feel free to reach out. And I'm happy to follow with the conversation.
Great. Thank you again so much. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank
See you in the next one.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.